Ever feel like the economy is this, like, big, mysterious thing that nobody actually understands?
Right. Like we hear all the time about like, markets going up and down and interest rates and all that, but
It's like, what are the actual forces at play? What's
oh,
going on behind the scenes?
exactly.
So to really try to like unpack that and figure out how this whole thing works, we're doing a deep dive today on Ray Dalio's How the Economic Machine Works. Have you seen this, by the way?
Yeah, yeah, I've seen it. It's dense.
It's a lot, right? It's very dense. There's a lot of information in there. But the thing about Dalio is that he really does a good job of taking these complex ideas, these complex systems, and kind of breaking them down in a way that, like, anybody can understand.
Yeah, no, he's got a real knack for making it kind of surprisingly clear, actually.
Yeah, surprisingly clear. So hopefully we can do that justice here today. Fingers crossed.
So Dahlia starts with this really simple concept, transactions.
And, like, when you think about it, every cup of coffee you buy, every, like, every paycheck you deposit, every time money changes hands, that's a transaction.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
And you add them all up, and guess what?
You got an economy.
You got an economy.
It's wild how that, like, the simplest things, you add enough of them together and it creates these massive complex systems.
Hardly.
Like we were saying, kind of like all the little gears and the cogs and how they all kind of interact together.
So then that brings us to credit,
Okay.
which Dalio refers to as like a double-edged sword.
Mm-hmm.
It can be really powerful, but it can also be very dangerous.
What's he getting up there?
Well, so credit is basically like a promise to pay in the future,
Okay.
right? So it allows us to do things like buy houses or start businesses that we wouldn't be able to do if we had to save up all the cash up front.
Right. It's like unlocking future possibilities.
Exactly. But it also, like, creates these cycles of boom and bust, right?
Yeah.
Because if credit is too easy to come by,
People get in over their heads.
people get in over their heads, they start spending money they don't have.
Yeah.
And then when the music stops, as they say.
Somebody's left holding the bag.
Exactly.
Yeah, I always think about that tractor example he uses.
Oh, yeah.
Borrowing to buy like a big screen TV, probably not generating any income to help pay that back.
Right.
But, if you borrow to buy a tractor and you can use that tractor to like, improve your farm output and actually generate real income,
That's good debt.
that's good debt.
There's a difference.
Absolutely.
It's not all created equal.
Yeah, and it all comes back to like, what is that debt actually fueling? Is it productive investments that are going to generate future income? Or is it just, consumption just for the sake of consumption?
So how does this, I mean, because those are like kind of micro examples.
Yeah.
How does that play out on like a larger macroeconomic scale?
Well, Dalio talks about two key cycles, right? You've got the short-term debt cycle, which is like 5 to 8 years. And then you've got the longer-term debt cycle, which can stretch out over like 75 to 100 years.
Oh, wow. Okay, so what's the main difference between those two cycles?
So the short-term cycle, that's the one that tends to grab the headlines, right? It's all about the availability of credit.
Okay.
When banks are like eager to lend money and interest rates are low, people tend to borrow more, spend more, invest more.
Right.
And that can lead to this, a period of economic growth, but
It can also lead to inflation if things get out of control.
exactly, yeah, it's like a delicate dance. It's about like how aggressively the central bank is managing things, right?
So that's where you see all these news segments like, is the Fed going to raise interest rates? Are they going to lower interest rates?
Right, exactly.
Because it has this huge ripple effect on the economy.
Huge, yeah. Like raising rates, that makes borrowing more expensive, right?
Yeah.
So that can help, cool down inflation if things are getting too overheated, but
It could also trigger a recession if people can't afford to like get loans and, invest and whatever.
it's a tough needle to thread, right?
Yeah.
And then on the flip side, lowering rates, well, that makes it easier to borrow, encourages people to spend and invest more, which sounds great on paper, but
But it could just be putting off the problem.
yeah, you might just be kicking the can down the road, leading to another boom and bust cycle later on.
Right. Okay, so we've got the short-term cycle. What about this long-term debt cycle? That sounds, I mean, 75 to 100 years, that's a whole lifetime.
Yeah, it's a slow burn, right?
Yeah.
This one's more insidious, I think, because it unfolds over decades, right?
Yeah.
Debt just kind of steadily accumulates.
Okay.
And for a while, it might seem like no big deal, right? Because ideally, incomes are rising along with debt.
Right.
But eventually,
The bill comes due.
the bill always comes due.
And what seemed manageable for like, a decade or two suddenly isn't.
Exactly. And here's where it gets really interesting, because human behavior plays a huge role in this.
Oh, here we go. The psychology of it all.
When times are good, what do we tend to do?
Spend money.
We spend money, we borrow more, we take on more risk.
Even if it means, like, having to pay more later or...
Exactly, yeah. Like, the future seems far off,
Yeah.
right?
Well, yeah. Live for today.
I get a little optimistic, a little complacent, and before you know it, you're in over your head.
Okay, so we keep kicking that can down the road. What happens when we finally hit a wall?
Well, Dalio calls that deleveraging, and it's not pretty.
It sounds painful.
It can be. It's like, imagine hitting a wall at full speed. Those debt burdens, they get too heavy to carry.
Okay.
And simply lowering interest rates, that's not going to cut it anymore.
So it's not just about, like, a recession, a normal recession. This is
a whole different beast.
Okay.
Dalio, he points to the Great Depression in the 1930s and then the 2008 financial crisis. He says those weren't just recessions. Those were full-blown deleveraging events.
Those are, like, the worst-case scenarios.
Yeah, the kind of things that keep economists up at night.
Okay, so how does this whole deleveraging thing actually play out?
Well, Dalio, he outlines these 4 main stages: austerity, debt reduction, wealth redistribution, and printing money.
Okay. Those sound like pretty intense, like, things in action.
They are, and they often happen in sequence, but it's not always neat and tidy. It can get messy.
Okay, well, let's break those down. So
Right.
starting with austerity,
Okay.
what exactly does that look like in this context? Is it just like everybody tightening their belts?
That's the basic idea. Individuals, businesses, governments, they all cut back on spending.
Sorry.
They try to pay down their debts.
Sounds good in theory.
Sounds logical, right? Live within your means.
Yeah.
But here's where it gets tricky. Austerity, it can actually make the debt burden worse in the short term.
Hold on, how does that even work? Less spending makes debt worse.
It seems counterintuitive, but think about it. When everybody cuts back on spending, what happens?
People lose their jobs.
People lose their jobs, incomes fall.
The economy shrinks.
Exactly, because one person's spending is another person's income.
Right.
So as incomes decline, it actually becomes harder for people to keep up with those debt payments.
Debt burden gets heavier.
Heavier relative to what they're actually earning.
It's like this vicious cycle.
Exactly, yeah. And that brings us to the next stage, debt reduction.
Okay.
This one's a little more straightforward. It can take a couple of forms. You've got defaults, where borrowers just can't pay what they owe.
Right.
And then you've got restructurings, where lenders and borrowers have to renegotiate the terms of the debt.
So like a compromise.
Yeah, exactly. So you might see, like, a homeowner who can't afford their mortgage payments anymore. They might go to the bank and say, hey, can we work something out?
Lower interest rate, longer payment schedule, something like that.
Exactly, yeah. Maybe even forgive some of the debt. Now, debt reduction, it helps to shrink that overall debt burden eventually, but
But it can be painful in the short term.
oh yeah, lenders, they face losses, economic activity can stall, and things can get, well, a little tense socially and politically.
Right. Nobody likes it when things are bad and they feel like they have to give something up.
Right. Which is where wealth redistribution comes in.
Yeah.
When things get really bad, governments, they often feel pressure to step in and try to, redistribute wealth from the haves to the have-nots.
Right. So like increasing taxes on the wealthy, providing more social services, things like that.
Exactly. Governments, they're seeing their tax revenue decline because incomes are down. But at the same time, they're facing this increased demand for social programs, unemployment benefits, things like that.
Yeah.
So they need to find a way to fund these programs. And that often means looking to those who have more.
Right. Which is always a really sensitive topic.
It's a tightrope walk for sure.
Okay. So we've talked about austerity, debt reduction, wealth redistribution. What about this last one? This is the one that I think a lot of people are kind of like, what is this? Printing money.
Right. This is the one that gets a lot of attention. And it sounds kind of crazy, right?
Yeah, like literally just printing more money. How does that actually...
Like we just hit print on the money machine.
Yeah. Does that really happen?
Well, not quite like that. It's not like, firing up the printing presses and just churning out stacks of cash.
Okay.
In reality, it's mostly done electronically these days. But essentially, the central bank, they create new money. And then they can use that newly created money to buy government bonds, other assets, which essentially pumps money into the economy.
Okay, so it's a way to kind of like inject some life into the system when traditional methods aren't working.
Exactly. And ideally, it helps to lower those long-term interest rates, get things moving again.
But I imagine there's like a downside to this, right?
Oh, there's always a trade-off. The big one is inflation.
Right, because if you just create a whole bunch of money...
It's like diluting the value of the currency, right?
Right.
So suddenly your dollar doesn't buy as much as it used to.
Everything's more expensive.
Exactly. And that's the risk, right? That's what central banks are always trying to balance.
It's like too much of a good thing, it becomes a bad thing.
Yeah, it's like, you need enough to keep the economy going, but not so much that you trigger runaway inflation.
Right. So Dalio argues that, I mean, even though deleveraging, it sounds kind of scary, like it sounds like a really painful process. He says it doesn't have to be an economic apocalypse, right?
Right. It doesn't have to be the end of the world. He believes that it's possible to kind of navigate this process in a more controlled way,
Okay.
less chaotic. He calls it a quote unquote beautiful deleveraging.
Beautiful deleveraging. That sounds almost optimistic for something that sounds kind of scary.
Right. A little counterintuitive, but he suggests that by carefully balancing those four elements that we just discussed,
Austerity, debt reduction.
wealth redistribution, and yes, even printing money.
Okay.
He thinks it's possible to achieve a more gradual, less painful deleveraging process.
So it's not like a crash landing, it's more like a controlled descent.
Exactly. So instead of this huge, spike in unemployment and economic collapse, you might see a slow but steady decline in debt, moderate economic growth, and then inflation that's, kept in check.
Okay. So still not great, but a lot better than the alternative.
Way better than the full-blown depression.
Right. But it does sound like it takes a lot of, like, cooperation and planning.
Coordination, yeah. It's not easy. It takes central banks, governments, even the private sector all working together.
So it's not just about understanding how the economic machine works. It's also about, like, having everybody be on the same page and kind of working together to steer it in the right direction.
Absolutely. And being willing to make some tough choices, maybe accept some short-term pain for the sake of long-term gain.
So given all that, I mean, we're not the Federal Reserve, we're not, running a major corporation. What can everyday people actually do? Like, how do we take this knowledge and actually apply it to our own lives?
Well, you're right. We're not in the driver's seat of the entire economy. But Dalio, he offers a few really, I think, insightful rules of thumb.
Okay, let's hear them.
That we can all apply to our own lives. So the first one, probably the most straightforward, don't let your debt rise faster than your income.
Don't spend more than you make.
Exactly. Seems like common sense, right?
Yeah.
But it's easy to lose sight of that. We live in a world with easy credit, instant gratification.
It's very tempting.
It is very tempting, but, that debt eventually has to be repaid.
What goes up must come down.
Exactly. So that's rule number one. Rule number two, a little bit more nuanced, avoid letting your income rise faster than your productivity.
Okay, so, like, make sure you're actually earning those raises, not just, like, riding a wave of, easy money or whatever.
Exactly. And that goes for countries as well, right? Like if a country's standard of living is only going up because of borrowing from the future or inflating asset prices.
Not sustainable.
It's not sustainable. It's like building a house on a foundation of sand. Looks good for a while, but eventually
reality sets in.
Exactly. Which brings us to rule number 3, and I think this is probably the most important. Focus on raising your productivity.
Work smarter, not harder.
In a sense, yeah. It's about investing in your skills, your knowledge, becoming more efficient at what you do. And then on a larger scale, it's about fostering innovation, investing in education.
So really it's about, like, building a better future.
Right.
It's not just about, like, trying to game the system or get ahead by taking shortcuts. It's about actually creating something of value.
Absolutely. And Dalio, he emphasizes that these principles, they're essential for individuals, businesses, governments, everybody.
We're all in this together.
We are all in this together.
Well, this has been a fascinating deep dive into Ray Dalio's How the Economic Machine Works. We've covered a lot of ground. We talked about transactions, credit, debt cycles, deleveraging, beautiful deleveraging even. It's a lot to digest. But I think the big takeaway here is that even though these systems seem really complex, they are understandable. And by understanding them, we can make more informed choices, both in our own lives and as a society. So thanks for joining us on this journey. Until next time.